Welcome to the first of our weekly summaries on Wordsworth, Poetry, People and Place. I'm very pleased to be joined by Sally Bushell and by Frank Pearson. So the aim of these sessions is for us to respond to your comments and your queries as they've come through in the course of the week. And first of all, what we'd like to say is we've been delighted by your engagement with the course. We've really very much enjoyed reading all your comments. I've certainly learnt a lot from them, so please keep them coming, and each week we'll meet like this to try and respond to them. So I'm going to hand over to Frank, who's obviously one of our excellent team of mentors, and he's been working throughout the week responding to your comments to pick out some of the main strands and some of the main queries that you brought to us.
Well, I've got a few questions. I was going to ask you the first two, Simon, about background and context, and then to you, Sally. Mm-hmm. One of the ones that has emerged from the beginning of the MOOC is the context, and Wordsworth's context. And I think this is quite interesting that many writers, some people have mentioned Shakespeare, we know so little about them, and their context doesn't really interfere with the play. Whereas with Wordsworth, it's almost impossible to see Wordsworth outside of the lakes, even though he went to many other places and he didn't stay there all the time. So I think one of the points that students have raised is this idea of the context and the background and Wordsworth's sense of place, almost like no other poet, really. So I just wanted...
Well, so a number of very interesting themes, I think, emerge from that, Frank. One, of course, is that what we think of as romantic writing or romantic period writing is very much a writing of the self. This could be seen as one of the revolutions we associate with Romanticism, and Wordsworth is the key figure for that. Of course, next week we'll be looking at the Prelude, which is his own autobiography, his own story of the self. As you say, he's also very much a poet associated with the Lake District, another of the major themes of Romanticism being the value attached to nature. And I've seen some really interesting discussions on the course there around nature and what it means and what it brings as well. And I think clearly one of the things that has surprised a lot of people is how we associate Wordsworth with Grasmere, but actually how this period of his life before he settles in Grasmere, the time he's in France, the affair with Annette, which has clearly captured people's interest in a strong way.
Yeah, and that was the other point really, is that we've seen so much of Wordsworth, in the Lake District, but a number of the students have also picked out on the unknown Wordsworth, the surprising Wordsworth really. So there's so much we do know about him, but then there's this really quite interesting point that we don't, that he had a lover and they had a child who grew up in France during the Revolution, and this idea that he was in the French Revolution as well. He was visiting France, during that revolutionary period. So this unknown Wordsworth is quite interesting as well. Many students have pointed out.
Very interesting. As you say, there are these two kind of key events, if you like, in Wordsworth's young life. Which clearly shape who he is and who he becomes and what he writes about, though he doesn't write about them that directly. So the first of these is the French Revolution. As we know, he was in France during a period of the Revolution. He was a very strong sympathiser in the early stages of the Revolution, famously declaring, "Bliss was it in that dawn to be alive." He writes a political pamphlet in which he advocates the execution of the King of England. He's that passionate. As French history changes, he moves away from that very pro-revolutionary sensibility and does eventually write his own account of this in the Prelude in books 9 and 10. So if people are interested in following up on his politics, then books 9 and 10 of the Prelude are the main place to go. But I guess the striking thing there is that his association with the revolution becomes something he eventually feels very guilty about. And then clearly, as you say, the other hidden element is the affair with Annette, fathering his daughter Caroline, which again remains very hidden, which he never really writes about. That doesn't really come to light until about a century ago, I think, the 1920s. So it does remain very hidden. So I guess one of the interesting elements with Wordsworth is, to what extent is the Wordsworth we know, the poets living in Grasmere, a response to these two very difficult experiences in his early life?
I think it's also worth remembering that we're always, there isn't a static version of Wordsworth. So, people who don't work in literary period don't realise that. They think, there's one kind of Wordsworth for all time. But, the Victorians, very much from almost all the Romantic writers, construct a version of those writers, which we then inherit, and often then the 20th century undoes, or starts to undo critically the Victorian perception. So you've always got a kind of layered history. And that idea of writers either covering up their own the version of themselves that they may or may not want told. Wordsworth's not dishonourable towards Annette, so I don't think he needs to be ashamed. But Hardy would be another example where Hardy sort of writes his own biography, and in order to ensure that a certain version of himself is presented to the world. So that's quite common in the 19th century, a sort of idealisation really of the figure of the poet.
What is interesting, what learners are picking up on, is that there is a very different Wordsworth from the well-known Wordsworth. And if you were to ask, who is the Romantic poet who's had the wildest youth, most people would say, it's Byron, or it's Shelley. But actually, it turns out to be Wordsworth.
Same issue though, because Wordsworth lived so long. So Wordsworth lives into the Victorian period massively. He doesn't die till 1850.
Right.
So actually, he's reconstructed by those Victorians as this old, he's an old figure, a figure of an old man for the Victorians, whereas Shelley and Byron die young. That's to your advantage in lots of ways. You're still dashing and good looking and not bald. Sorry.
We'll just pass over that, I think. And one of the things that's been really nice on the course, though, is the way in which the learners have found resources and posted them. So actually, we could rehearse the history of Wordsworth and Annette's now, but actually people have found some really good material and made it available for everyone else. So it's really nice, that sense of a kind of supportive community. So thanks to everybody who's been involved in that kind of work for the course.
Well, another question, I think in many ways it comes out of what we've just been talking about there, that we've got Wordsworth, this person who wants to be a poet, it's the moment, it's the French Revolution, the world has changed, he wants to change, everything's changing, and he's the person potentially that's got the language to do it. And that, in a way, brings the next question that many of the students have raised, is this interesting point for the preface of the Lyrical Ballads, where he talks about spontaneity and that it's just spontaneous overflow of feeling. This eruption and this overflowing and bursting, revolutionary moment. But then all the work that you did, Sally, on the manuscripts, on the drafting and the drafting and the drafting, and people writing things out and then reworking them and so on. So a number of students have drawn out this idea of the contradiction of the spontaneity, but then the very carefully structured work that follows.
So I suppose there's a question of what you mean by spontaneous. So I said this in feedback to someone, that are you talking about spontaneous composition, or are you talking about and writing, or are you talking about spontaneous feeling? And that's actually critical for Wordsworth, because what he's and what does it mean to be spontaneous? You can you be spontaneous repeatedly, for example? You think, well, no, you can't. But in Wordsworth's terms, you can, because each time you return to that moment, if that moment is powerful enough in your memory, we're going to look at this next week, so lots of time, if it's a powerful interaction with nature that has shaped who you are, then each return you feel those things anew as if it were the first time. And so this is a very odd definition of spontaneous in a way, but that's what he means by it, spontaneous emotion, I think, rather than spontaneous writing. Again, though, of course, once you start to have an idealised version of the poet, particularly later in the Victorian period, then those two things start to merge, and you start to have a poet like Tennyson very anxious about his own poetic practice and defensive of it and hiding it, because he doesn't think he does write. He doesn't write spontaneously. He doesn't come to him immediately straight out. So therefore, he's not a good poet. Actually, very few poets is that true for. Keats is about the only one who that's probably really true for.
It's a big sort of way in which the Romantic poets what we think of now as the Romantic poets represent themselves,
Yeah.
though, isn't it, as spontaneous. I was thinking of Byron, poetry is the lava of the imagination whose eruption prevents an earthquake, or Shelley's the skylark, pourest forth thy heart in profuse strains of unpremeditated art.
Yeah.
But, as you say, once you actually start looking at the compositional habits,
Yeah.
those are rarely,
Yeah.
very rarely the case.
Well, and again, that comes down to the other key theme,
Yeah.
which is imagination and the power of the imagination. And again, if your imagination is of the highest order, then it should simply be sort of flowing through you.
Yeah.
You're in this heightened state,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
hence the use
Yeah.
of various narcotics to get you to that heightened state. And so it's linked to that, imagination. And if you're not doing that, then maybe your imagination isn't actually of the first order. It's a sort of, B or C minus grade imagination.
Wordsworth, we should emphasise, wasn't keen on the use of narcotics. His friend Coleridge, of course, did use them more. And if people want to look at that, then Kubla Khan is the text to go for.
Yeah. Great. And the other question that I had for you, Sally, was taken from Table's Turn, which again is a very popular poem, of Wordsworth's, and I think there are so many single lines that stand out for people. It's very clear with that one. So sort of spontaneous wisdom and a heart that watches and receives, and let nature be your teacher.
Yeah, let nature be your
as
teacher.
well as we murder to dissect and so on and so forth. And so a number of students have really engaged with this poem, and in many ways, to me, what I see is their lives coming straight into contact with it. And it's as if he was in some way articulating their feelings as well. And there were so many students have posted their own aspects of let nature be your teacher and so on. So you get this notion that Wordsworth is, in fact, even though several hundred years ago, he is our contemporary. And I was just wondering how you feel that.
Yeah. I mean, I agree about the kind of single lines that stand out. It's the Wordsworth poem for the T-shirt, isn't it? Let nature be a teacher. So if anyone wants to go ahead and send them to us, that'd be great. Yes, I mean, I think it's a good example in the lyrical ballads of Wordsworth sort of both doing what he should be doing and not. Yeah. So he's using the ballad form, the simplicity of the ballad form. Let nature be your teacher is a good example, to create very simple, clear expressions. A bit like Blake, when Blake does this, he uses the aphorism to a very memorable phrase. I mean, that's a very simple phrase actually, but it encompasses a lot. Yeah. So he both uses the form simply, and when I do teach this with students, I quite often say just either choose one line that stands out for you or one verse that stands out for you, or look at how many syllables there are. So some of it are very, very simple lines. Of moral evil and of good, then all the sages can. They're simple one-syllable words. So it's using the ballad to be direct and accessible, and that's what people respond to really well. But in fact, what he's communicating is quite a complex message. So it's sort of doing both things. In the previous poem, which wasn't on the site, but I'm sure people have looked at as well, that the Table's Turn is responding to. Expostulation and reply. He talks about we can feed this mind of ours in a wise passiveness, and that's in a way as well what the poems are about. What Wordsworth's often saying is poetry. For Wordsworth, poetry isn't even necessarily words. Actually, surprisingly, it's a state of mind. It's having a certain attitude towards the world. Yeah. And wise passiveness in the other poem really sums that up. Right. That being a poet is having a certain kind of receptivity, a certain kind of openness, and being willing to be acted upon in that way by nature for Wordsworth. And again, that's something that for us, and it'll almost come back round in the 20th, 21st century with eco-criticism and our sense of man's interference in the planet. Yeah. Those positions become very, very attractive to us again, right. I think.
Yeah, great. Well, there was just one final one really, and it was a short one, and it just started to appear. I don't think many students have got to that point just yet, but it was on The Old Man Travelling, and it was on the subtitle of The Old Man Travelling, and the reference to animal tranquility and so on. Yeah. And that had brought out a number of interesting interpretations, you know, about what do we mean by animal tranquility. What is he talking about? Himself, is he just saying he's like everybody else? I mean, why bring in an adjective like that?
Okay, so I did a quick Google search in the hope that someone else had answered that question, but they hadn't, even on Google Scholar, before we came today. And we haven't had that question before either on this is the third year of the MOOC, so kudos to those who asked it. So in lieu of Google Scholar, I'll have a go myself. It's definitely about the old man, so it's describing the old man himself, and actually takes that out. It's a subtitle in the early version, it takes it out in the later version, and just has Old Man Travelling as the title. Yeah. So Old Man Travelling, animal tranquility and decay. And so when I was looking at it, trying to give an answer that would help people, and what I would say is, the whole of the first section of the poem, if you look at the old man, two things happen with him. He's both sort of marginalised, actually marginalised from the human world, and naturalised. So the first line, the little hedgerow birds that peck along the road regard him not. That's really interesting. So on the one hand, he's less than the birds, and also, you know, they should be scared of him. He's a human being who could hurt them, so they should be flying away, but they're not. Yeah. So it's almost as if he's part of that landscape. He's naturalised as a human, and so he's depicted in the first part of the poem, almost as an animal. You know, and Wordsworth's very interested in sentience, non-sentience. You know, sort of putting a story around an object, a stone, you know, a jug, a thing that you think has no meaning, and giving it meaning, or making you see it has a meaning that you didn't immediately see. And so in a way he's doing this with the old man, but in a very odd way. So sort of dehumanising him totally in the first half, as if he's just another object almost. And in fact the narrator, who you know is later shown up to be very limited in doing this, is sort of objectifying the man. And so you could almost say, you know, the subtitle is Old Man Travelling, that's okay. You know, Animal Tranquility and Decay, that's the narrator. You know, that's actually a judgment on the narrator. He's belittling what this man is. Now, of course, then in the final lines, as many people were reading, commenting on very well, it's totally turned on its head, and you realise he's not, you know, he's not this sort of, you know, weird being, or sort of idealised, slightly disturbing force. Actually, he's a human being with, you know, a story attached to him, classic Wordsworth, that is really sad and moving. So actually, Mr. Narrator, you know, you got it totally wrong. So anyway, that's it.
Great stuff. Thank you, Sally.
Thank you, Sally. That's one of a number of terrific readings of the poem. I think one of the features for me of the course this week has been that some of the great close readings of Old Man Travelling and The Tables Turned have been a pleasure to read. So thank you very much, Frank. Thanks for all your work this week. We look forward to working with you over the next few weeks. Thanks very much, Sally. Thank you very much to everyone out there who's been engaging with the course. So next week, in week 2, we're going to look at Wordsworth's great autobiographical epic masterpiece, The Prelude. So we'll begin by seeing you again in the Jerwood Centre, where Jeff Cowton is going to talk us through the magnificent collection of the Wordsworth Trust's holdings of manuscripts of The Prelude. We're going to make visits to Wordsworth's Grammar School at Hawkshead. We'll be going up to Ullswater and looking at one of Wordsworth's spots of time. So we very much look forward to seeing you all again then.